I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't really know how I'm gonna make this review. The Minish cap was a really fun experience, and honestly, it took me forever to beat, but when I finally did, sitting back and pondering on how I felt about the game, I found fairly difficult. This game obviously wasn't perfect, but finding ways to critique it was just kind of difficult in some ways, which is why this is definitely going to be a Zelda game that's going to be hard for me to just describe how I feel about. And I will say, while this is almost a promotion video for playing it on NSO, I did play the original on the Game Boy Advance cartridge, because I bought this just a few months ago, and then the NSO version was announced, and I felt like I had just wasted $20, but hey, at least I finished this video on time, kind of. So yeah, here is my review of why you should play The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. To begin, this game is just straight up fun, and I love that it doesn't take itself very seriously at all. After all, one of the main items that you will use constantly throughout the game is called the Gust Jar, which literally just blows wind and sucks things up, and it's kind of a fun but unique item that you can use in so many different scenarios, and that just kind of sets the tone for the rest of the game. But I will say that something that I don't necessarily like about this game right away is that it follows the traditional Zelda formula maybe a little bit too much in terms of locations. We start in the forest, and then we go to the mountains, then we go to some ruins, then we go to a graveyard. It seems very reminiscent of what an average Zelda game would look like in terms of locations, and also Vati as a main villain is kind of fun, but his motivations are really strange in this game. At the very start of the game, when you are first introduced to Vati, he is kind of misunderstood. I mean, he's obviously trying to help people out, at least that's what my first impression was when he releases the Picori Blade. But as it turns out, he just kind of turns evil. I don't really understand what his overall goal was until he's reintroduced, and he almost feels like a completely different character from when you first meet him. But yeah, this game is really fun in that it has Ezlo, which might be my favorite Zelda sidekick character that we've ever gotten, because he's just straight up entertaining, and also having a talking hat who's secretly a Picori magician is actually just a really fun and cute idea. And this game really can be described as fun and cute. There's really not a lot in this game that's super heavy, like in games like Ocarina of Time, and especially in Majora's Mask, and of course in the game that we will get to next, Twilight Princess, which just kind of makes this one stand out more. And as a 2D Zelda game, it feels proper, I guess. Comparing this to the last few handheld Zelda games, I really had to make excuses for most of them because they were very primitive in some ways. But in the case of Minish Cap on Game Boy Advance, it really isn't that bad. You still only have the 2 item slots, but it takes advantage of this much better, and you really feel like this was made for the Game Boy Advance. But one potential critique I do have is that this game released in 2005. The DS released in 2004. And I understand you can't just re-transition into making games for a different console so easily, but I do feel like this game might have been better as a DS game so long as they didn't use the touchscreen for controls. But that's kind of a minor critique, and just another reason for me to wish for this game to get a remaster, but with the NSO version coming, I don't really think that's going to happen. But the Minish Cap is really fun in those ways, but something I also have to talk about is the dungeons. And in the case of this game, I was kind of surprised, because the dungeons in this game are pretty good. There's very little for me to complain about. In fact, it's kind of similar to Wind Waker in that way, which is weird because the previous Zelda games on the Game Boy Color, and of course both of the N64 games, had at least one dungeon that I absolutely despised. But in the case of this game and the Wind Waker, that was not the case at all. The Minish Cap has really solid dungeons, but one potential critique is that they don't really stand out. Like, none of them are my least favorite, but none of them are really my favorite either. They're just kind of there. They're pretty good, but none of them are like amazing or anything. One thing I will say is really amazing about this game is the items. The items in this game are just wonderful. I absolutely love all of the items in this game. And one thing that I also love is that there's not too many of them. There's a fair balance, and you can see yourself using a lot of these items in different scenarios. And as a result, this game's pacing is really good. Another mechanic that I really like is the Kingstone pieces, which is not something I was expecting to like at all. In fact, I didn't really understand how it worked at first, but it's a really cool way of discovering secrets, basically merging these Kingstones with other individuals, and it can reveal like a really powerful enemy, a heart piece, or other things throughout the map. And at first I thought that the map wasn't very interactive, but as I did more of the Kingstone pieces, I realized that I was a complete idiot for thinking that way. And as a result, the Kingstone pieces really do give this game another flavor of uniqueness, which is something that this game definitely has in many ways. Minish Cap has a lot of original ideas. However, I wouldn't say it's completely original. It's still, like the Game Boy Color games, reuses a lot of characters from games like Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, and even A Link to the Past. And I understand nostalgia is obviously really useful in games, but I don't really know if I like how this game uses that. And it doesn't use it a ton, but it's enough to make me kind of wonder if this game would be better without it. Also, the original enemies in this game aren't really my favorites either. I mean, some of them are kind of cool ideas, but they just don't really fit in with the rest of the characters, I suppose, in this game. Also, from a visual perspective, and this is going to sound really harsh, and I feel bad for saying this, but I think proportion to hardware, this might be the cheapest looking Zelda game. And that's not to say it looks bad at all, because it doesn't. It looks good. But when you compare it to the wonderful art style of all of the Zelda games before and after, it just doesn't really fit in the best. Which means that I kind of wish it had a little bit different of an art style. But hey, at least it's more original, I suppose, and that I will give it credit for. Honestly, the Minish Cap just does so well at so many different things. While there are a lot of spots where I could critique it or nitpick it, it really does make up for it in many other ways. Also, the soundtrack for this game is amazing. There are so many great tunes, which is wonderful to see back in handheld Zelda games. And also, even though it's on the Game Boy Advance, there isn't really a lot of critiquing I can do with how the audio sounds. So yeah, I ended up really enjoying the Minish Cap, which is weird because I didn't really think I was going to at first, but this game really hooked me from the beginning, and I just continually kept playing it. However, one potential downside is that I can't really see myself playing it again, and I know, that's a weird critique to have. But when a game doesn't really have replayability like that, it does kind of point out a little bit of a concern. On top of that, comparing this Zelda game story to other Zelda games, I don't know if I like it as much, especially comparing it to games that I just played like Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, and even in some ways the Oracle games. This game doesn't really hold power as much. But I love the idea of shrinking into a Minish, and all of the interactions in this game are wonderful, which is why I'm really split on the score between a 7 or an 8. In the end, comparing to whether I think this is more like A Link to the Past or a little bit more like Majora's Mask, I guess I'll give The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap a very high but respectable 7 out of 10.